So, this is a video on the basics of essays. There are a few things about essays that may be different from other assignments doing, things like reports particularly. So essays tend to be quite discursive and evaluative of things. So they're really looking for you to think about what you're reading, think about how it fits into the field as a whole, think about what the people are saying and whether you agree with it as well. Essays are also unstructured in terms of you're not given a formal structure that you have to follow. So they're structured by you and you'll have to make decisions over that. Essays quite often deal with theory, so it goes back to that idea of them being quite discursive and evaluative. So it's a way of trying out ideas, putting ideas against each other and weighing them up. So really what you're looking for is also an argument. So it's not a case of just writing down everything that you know and everything that you've read. It's showing that you can weigh those things up against each other and come up with your own conclusion and your own argument. Things that you need to think about in essays. The first thing that you need to do is interpret the question. And it's surprising how many people don't do this and how many people don't do this before they start reading for the question. So people will tend to find the question, see what general topic it's on, go away and read everything that they can on that, and then come back and look at the question again and realise what they've been reading hasn't exactly answered the question as it's been set out. So it's important to do this before you do your research as well. So what you need to look for are instruction words, so words that tell you what to do. Part of that reason is sometimes lecturers or your tutors might give you a little bit of background and then the actual question. So you really need to pick out what the actual question is. So you're looking for instruction words. Subject words, which most people do look for, so that's the general overall topic that the question's about. It's usually the one that relates most closely to your module title. Then you need to look for any limit words. Now these are usually obvious limits, so things that tell you to look at things within a certain time period or a certain number of things or a certain geographical location. So they're usually quite straightforward. But on top of that, you also want to look for any focus words, and these are really key. So these are any words that narrow down the focus of the overall subject. And they're quite often very important because they give you something to argue about. So here's an example. Have a look at this and see if you can identify each of those elements that we've just spoken about. You can pause the video if you want. So here's the answer. So we've got the instruction words of critically analyse. Now that seems quite straightforward in that it's telling you to be critical, it's telling you to be analytical. If you don't quite understand what it means, replacing it with the word evaluate sometimes helps it make a bit more sense. Then we've also got the overall topic word. So the overall subject, which here is stratified medicine. So that's the kind of broader umbrella topic. We've got limit words, which are obvious. So last 5 years. So that's helpful to know in that if you're doing any reading, you might want to read further back than that for background, but really you're concentrating on examples and things for the last 5 years. And also we've got at least 2 case studies as examples. If anything ever says something like use at least 2 examples, it usually means around that number. So 2, maybe 3, but if you're thinking it's better because you're using 8, then it probably isn't because you're probably not looking at them in enough detail. Most importantly here though, we've got the focus word of cancer treatment. So stratified medicine, it can be used for various different kind of ailments and medical conditions, but it's really specifically asking you to look at cancer treatment. So stratified medicine might have been brilliant for looking at something like osteoporosis or rheumatism, but perhaps it's not been used as much or as successfully in different types of cancer treatment. So it gives you something to narrow down and to kind of make an argument about. So you can give a background to the whole of stratified medicine, how it's working, but then perhaps specifically how it has and hasn't worked in cancer treatment. So that focus word can also often be very important because it helps you evaluate things. Otherwise you'd be trying to do too much. The normal structure is pretty loose really, there's no formal one, but you do always need to include an introduction, a main body and a conclusion. Essentially, it's telling your reader what you're going to tell them, then telling them, and then telling them what you told them. So there's a few important things, particularly about introductions and conclusions, I think. So, A good introduction should say how you're going to answer the question, give an indication of the structure of the essay. You might define any very important terms, but really importantly, you don't want it to contain lots of unnecessary background. So if you were talking about stratified medicine, for example, you might have a sentence or two that says why stratified medicine's been so important. You might have a sentence or two saying what stratified medicine is, but then you probably want to go straight into an indication of how stratified medicine has worked with cancer treatment, and then a sentence or two about what the structure of your essay will be. So saying how stratified medicine has worked with the 2 or 3 examples you're going to use, and that gives a good indication of the structure. What you don't want is a background that says when stratified medicine started, who it was that first adopted it, who the main people who first used it were, because that's all unnecessary. So it's very important to stick to exactly what it is that your argument's going to be. So a good main body should have a logical structure, contain your evidence, and also contain analysis of that evidence. So it's very hard to give you a particular structure because it really depends on the question that you're answering. But I would say if you're struggling, think in terms of the 3 or 4 main points that you want to make. If you were going to put kind of subheadings in, what would they be? And then break that down. So you can also think in terms of comparing and contrasting things. You can think in terms of kind of yes, no and maybe answers. So going back to the stratified medicine one, say you decided to use 3 different examples. There might be 3 different elements of stratified medicine you want to look at. So you might look at the first element, so say it's cost, and then how that worked in each of those 3 case studies. Then you might look at effectiveness again in terms of those 3 case studies. So it can get more complicated than that, obviously, and certainly at master's level. But if you start with a simple structure and then try and fit things into it, then it will give you a kind of framework. Whereas if you go in straight away trying to think of all of the details, then you'll probably get quite lost and it'll get a little bit messy. A few things about how to use evidence and analysis. How you paragraph can really help how you put together the evidence and put in the analysis. What you should never do is leave your analysis as one big block at the end of something, which I have seen people do, because your reader will just get frustrated. They'll start to think you're not going to do any analysis. So, as I was saying, paragraphing can help with this. So a good example of a paragraph is called a P-paragraph. So it essentially means that every paragraph should have in it a sentence at the start, which is the point, basically what you're going to talk about in the paragraph. Then you usually put your evidence in, and then your last sentence or two will be the analysis of that evidence. So basically saying why that evidence is important, how it helps to answer the question or add to your argument. So here we've got the point which says there's several hurdles which need to be faced, including international collaboration and data sharing. So I basically know that you're talking about international collaboration and data sharing for the rest of this paragraph. Then we've got the evidence, so things about the NHS, things about initiatives that have been set up globally, European initiatives, and you can see that that's all cited and referenced. And then at the end we've got a bit of analysis that in this case points out how this might be difficult. So that's why it's important, this evidence, that's why what it's saying. In this case it's because something's changed. So a good conclusion again will summarise the points of the essay. It might highlight some important evidence. What's really important is it won't have any new evidence in it. So you shouldn't be throwing new references in there that you've not used before. You might re-reference a few people if you want to highlight what they've said, but they shouldn't be new. And what it should also do is draw into a final main point which answers the question. So go back to the question, reread it, and basically say how you've answered it. A couple of little style tips. In essays, we usually avoid using the word I, so you don't say I think, I found, I used. So you probably want to replace it with things like the evidence shows, or this essay will, or it is clear that. So just taking the word I out of it. It's basically to make you sound more objective. Also using hedging language. So by that I mean language which kind of says that you know that not all of these are absolutes. So for example, because you usually will have quite a focused essay, so for example we're focused on cancer treatment, You may say something like stratified medicine may help target groups of patients, because you're only using one tiny part of stratified medicine, so you can't be totally sure about all of it. So using things like may, usually, in this case, things like that. Also trying to avoid emotive language. It doesn't massively come up in science, but it can do. So basically language that's trying to provoke a response through emotion rather than evidence. So you would not say this clearly shows that this is an awful experience for patients. You might say something like, the evidence shows that 60% of patients said this was a negative experience. So we've got data rather than emotion. Remembering to be formal, so making sure you don't use things like slang or cliches, so you don't write exactly how you speak. Equally though, you don't want to overwrite, so you don't want to sound like you've swallowed a dictionary. So you don't need to necessarily use the longest word possible for everything. So be formal, but the most important thing is you're getting your ideas across clearly. If you want a few more tips, then I would look up, just Google Manchester Phrase Bank, and that literally is a list of different phrases you can use to put into your essays that make you sound a bit more academic and also perhaps help you move through things. Just to finish up, a couple of common mistakes as well. So the first one, not sticking to the question. So not really having identified what you're trying to do, ending up just writing everything you know on the topic, sort of writing around things because you've not really got an argument. So you need to read the question, really think about what it is that you want to say. Plan around that before you do your reading as well, so you're reading with that in mind, and that will really help you stick to the question. Other things, describing rather than analysing. Again, that often means people haven't really identified the question in their argument beforehand, so when they go and do their reading, they just pick up on lots of information and then regurgitate it into the essay. So it means you're not really coming up with an argument, not really analysing. Other things, not structuring. Again, sometimes that can mean that people have got caught up in the detail in the reading and they've just sort of put it in any old way, when really what you want to do is think about your 3 or 4 main points, break those down. Not checking your spelling and grammar. There's no proofreading service at the university. It is up to you to get that done. And the last one as well is often using poor quality reading material. So the reading that you do is really important. So if you've not already had a session or contacted your academic support librarian, I'd recommend that you do that. Find out how to get good quality academic material. First of all, because you'll get better credit for that being in your reference list and using it as evidence, but also because if you're reading good quality academic material, it gives you much more of an idea of what you're aiming at in your own writing. Okay, so if you want any more help and support, there's plenty of support for essay writing on the Skills for Learning website, and we also do further workshops as well.